Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to Data and AI Live. Thank you very much for joining us wherever you are in the world. Sorry we're running slightly late, but glad to have you here now. Today we are going to be talking about a very in vogue hot topic, I think, across a lot of organizations, namely talent strategy for data and AI transformation. And our guest is James Bryce, who we're incredibly lucky to have because James is one of the few people, I think, so far who've led an enterprise-wide AI transformation, namely at Virgin Media O2, over the last 12 months. So we'll bring him in now. Welcome, James. Nice to see you.
Hello. Hi, James.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, good. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Did I get my introduction on point?
I think so. I probably say I'm not the only person involved, so I wouldn't say I'd led it entirely on my own, but it's a team effort, right?
Absolutely, yeah. In terms of, I guess, what struck me though, chatting to you off air, and I think we're going to kind of extrapolate this out as we go through, but is the level of detail that you and the organisation have gone into planning from a talent perspective around this transformation, which I think is, as I say, something we'll try and expand upon and extrapolate out, because I think that what I see, and I'm sure you do as well, the mistakes that are made is a lot of organizations might plan the strategy very well, but the talent strategy around that not so much, and often that's left as a sort of afterthought and maybe a bit haphazard, and things can really go wrong badly on that. So just to give everyone an overview of what we're going to cover today as we go through. First of all, we're going to talk about value creation verticals, which is kind of basically we're going to discuss the use cases within Virgin Media O2 that have sort of driven this transformation. Then we're going to move on and talk about the flywheel effect, which is a concept we'll discuss that can aid in transformation, and we'll sort of discuss who and how has been hired. And then finally we'll talk about talent density and that concept, which is a really good concept, I think, for organizations to understand and leverage, and the results of this talent strategy. And then after that, just before I forget, finally, what we will also discuss, I think, is a really important topic at the moment, which is around sort of workforce development for organizations in the age of AI. And the concept there is, and James is, I mean, look, I don't think anyone's a bit of an expert in this, but I think James knows what he's talking about to some extent, and has looked into and researched this topic. And the concept of it is that many of us, I think, when we started in our careers and jobs, would have started in heavy admin roles within the organizations we worked for, and typically that's been the way that you get into a career and learn a business. In the age of AI, much of those tasks that we all started doing are going to get taken away. So it's how do you develop that workforce in the future, in the age of AI? And we're going to talk about that because I think it's really interesting, but also hugely important from a talent management perspective moving forward as well. So yeah, let's get into it, James. I guess a good place to start, though, perhaps is can you give us some sort of context as to this data and AI transformation within Virgin Media and O2 and the telco industry in general, and kind of how, I guess, this process came about?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I've only been with the organization just over a year, so a lot of this work was conducted prior to me joining, where historically telcos have developed and grown off the back of technology infrastructure changes. So if you think back 3 decades, where the telco industry would have started from GSM to 5G in mobile, and then from coax to fiber and fixed line, the organizations have inherently grown off the back of technology infrastructure changes. Now, in a world where the industries are converging, and you see competition from non-traditional disruptors, streaming companies, other players in this market, that context has accelerated the need for change. So we have this concept of convergence, where we're having to become much more consumer centric, much more customer driven. And as those customer expectations are increasing exponentially, we have to respond in turn and have the right teams, systems, and architecture to deal with that. So that's really an industry-wide context. From a VMO2 perspective, obviously we're the result of a joint venture, 50-50 joint venture between two of our owners, Liberty Global and Telefonica. And both of those organizations felt there were significant synergies for the joining of O2 and Virgin Media to become VMO2 a little over 3 years ago now. As part of that merger, we'd obviously need to look critically at where we're going to get the most value from the joint venture and from the two organizations merging.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for that context. So let's, or just before we get into it, actually, a couple of things, housekeeping for everyone that we've got on the LinkedIn Live. Number one, it's live and interactive, so feel free to ask questions as we go through anytime that you like. We will do right at the end a Q&A with James, but we may also introduce questions as and when they come up. So either way, if questions come into your mind that you want to ask, please put them in the comments as soon as they come to your mind. And secondly, just so we can get a straw poll, I guess, of who we've got and where you are as an audience on your journey, can you put in the comments, everyone who's watching, either yes or no to answer the question, is your organization currently going through a data and AI transformation? Yes or no, please, in the comments, because as I say, it'll give us an idea of who our audience is, but it also help us out with the algorithm immensely. So yeah, thank you very much. James, let's get it. And thanks for the context on VMO2. I think that'll be helpful. And actually, I think a lot of organizations will probably be going through similar convergences in terms of markets, and also probably thinking about sort of customer centricity in a similar way as well, even if they're not in telco. So I think that was really interesting. But in terms of let's start with value creation verticals then. So
Yeah.
tell me about, I guess, because it's one thing sort of thinking, well, we need to leverage AI in a better way, or leverage AI at all. But I think what's important is understanding what use cases you're going to do that for in the business, and why it's an imperative. So tell us about that in the context of VMO2.
Yeah, so I mean, when you do a merger at this scale, or you bring two large organizations together, you inevitably end up leveraging third-party support to look at where you can leverage greatest value. For us, we did some initial work with McKinsey, quickly followed by some work with Boston Consulting Group around our operating model and where we could gain greatest value. If I look at those verticals across the organization, they're not limited to just a telco, and they're similarly not limited to a techco, which was our aspiration in terms of our transformation objective. We have a value creation vertical in our commercial converged space. We have a value creation vertical in our digital technology and IT architecture space, in particular around data, and in particular around our product suites. So those verticals aren't, shall we say, bespoke to Virgin Media O2, and I'm sure lots of organizations would commonly also identify those verticals. What we did, which I think was unique, was identified the from and to. Where are we currently baselining our capabilities in those areas? So from individual subscriber models, proposition design, functional use cases, competing for data, contract fulfillment, those more traditional areas, to where we wanted to be, and trying to move from areas like functional use cases to platform, from things like availability to resilience. It's about this movement from the current status quo into the future fit model. And I think in particular, when you looked at that through the data, technology, and IT lens, you could see how much there was to go after. And you could see how much upside there was, both in commercial terms, but also in efficiency terms, if we were to get it right. So for me, the transformation wasn't, as you said earlier, just about articulating the strategy. It was about having executable metrics and measures along the way that showed that you were making progress against those value creation verticals. We're still continuing that to this day. It's not a sort of end-to-end process. It's a continual cycle, if you like, of checking. But we did also recognize in the creation of those value creation verticals we also needed the right talent strategy, and we also needed the right talent map to get us there.
Yeah, it's again, what I'm hearing, I'll go back to the point I made a minute ago. I mean, the level of detail that's gone in here is, I think, unusual, but good. Um, uh, one of the things that I spoke about on the show 2 weeks ago with Richard Sargent from BCG was focusing on business imperatives, which is clearly what's happened here in terms of the value creation verticals, and then linking the talent strategy with that as well. As I say, is pretty smart to do all of that up front. And I guess the other thing I hear, which is unusual as well, is the fact that there are metrics within each value creation vertical which are continuously being tracked to this day. Again, which I think is great, great level of detail, and something that's quite unusual. So, anything else, I guess, in terms of value creation verticals at this
I
point, or
think
should we?
I
Do
think
you want
there's,
to move on to the flywheel?
we can move to the firewall.
Mm,
Just one point I forgot to
mm,
mention is making sure that you recognise the outside in perspective on your sector. So if we talk about convergence through a lens of other organizations or other teams that have been through similar transformations, we saw huge utility in borrowing some of that experience and bringing it into the sector. So I'm a big advocate of cross-sector hiring, cross-sector sourcing, and bringing leadership in from other organizations that perhaps traditionally might not have been contributing to a telco leadership team.
yeah. I mean, how did you identify those organisations that had been through similar? Was that just a question of asking around the market, speaking to your
Yeah,
consultancy partners? I mean, because
and
sometimes that's not obvious. That's not
there was
obvious
no
sometimes.
data answer, unfortunately, Jeremy. There was no data shortcut to get that answer quickly. Exactly what you say. It was a lot of legwork in interviewing, fact finding, working with partners in the market, talking to similar organizations. So you've got peer to peer organizations, and then you've got adjacent sectors, and then you've got synergistic sectors. So the
Mm,
synergistic is where we were trying to get to, where you wouldn't necessarily think there were synergies. You'd go to look for them. There is some adjacency that people recognize, perhaps technology companies, perhaps software companies, perhaps some other infrastructure and utility companies that work in a similar space to us. And then, of course, there's your peer organizations. What I had to try and do really quickly was to identify those synergies and then bring those through into our talent map, which isn't easy because there's a cultural piece to this. There's a, do people recognize what they're looking at in the market? And when they meet these individuals, do they recognize their value and what they can bring to the transformation program?
yeah, I think that's a great lesson because I mean, anyone who's worked in talent will understand the reaction you sometimes get if you put what you feel is a great candidate, but for another industry in front of a leader, and the response is, well, why would I hire someone from this sector? So I think doing that work and identifying those domain synergies up front is a great thing, really. Um, so yeah, let's move on to the flywheel effect then. And this is a concept that, yeah, I don't know. Some people will know about, but others won't. Some people will know about it, but maybe not in the context of hiring and talent. So, do you want to sort of, I guess, start with the flywheel effect concept
Yeah, of
and
course.
how that's linked to talent strategy for a large scale transformation?
Yeah, so originally, for those of you that will be familiar with this, this is an Amazon concept for their sales and their development and delivery cycle. So it starts with this idea of injecting the greatest impetus or the greatest effort into the part of the sales cycle that's going to have the greatest effect. And you can literally Google now, the Amazon flywheel effect, and you'll see lots of diagrams from business journals and articles about this. Our perspective and our recognition was that you could do something similar using a talent metaphor, if you like, or using a talent theory. The idea of selecting at the top end of the flywheel the right people, then the idea of creating a top class candidate experience and a top class consumer experience for those people that you were trying to bring into your organization. And then checking the landing place, if you like, or the arrival spot in the business in their first 3, 6, and 9 months to make sure they were getting traction and getting some sort of adherence, if you like, in a very dynamic, difficult to land environment, and then making sure that other people became sellers and advocates of that approach as well. So you went to this full loop. But to break it down in really simple terms, if you inject the right talent in the right place at the right time, it has a compounding effect. It effectively punches above its weight for the hire that you've made, because you've identified the gap, you've filled the gap at the right time with the right person. So it's those three things together.
Yeah, and I guess that's particularly important for large enterprise organizations, because you can't hire 5,000 people
Exactly that.
necessarily from a AI or tech enabled background. But it's, so how do you identify then? I guess the interesting part is, how do you go about identifying which roles are the important ones
Yeah.
to be part of that flywheel effect?
I mean, to break it down really simply, it's the ones which have the strongest commercial case for change. So if I share with you a couple of tangible examples, if you look at things like end state architecture and your architecture estate in your organization, there's masses of opportunity there to either remove duplication or to improve the system of architecture that you've got. If you look at things like our product vertical, where we have numerous products that we sell in different ways, creating a consolidated approach to that product model in a business of our size, serving 46 million customers, it's a huge benefit if you can get that improved at pace and at speed, which is really important. You don't get years to do this; it's measured in months, really. So we look for those commercial gains first. We also look for, again, going back to the adjacency point, we look for organizations that have successfully done it already, and measure and benchmark ourselves against those organizations. How competitive are we? How does it feel compared to other user experiences and other consumer experiences that people are offered? And that's new territory, because traditionally you'd have measured yourself against industry peers, but by measuring yourself against non-traditional players and disruptors, it's actually advancing your thinking or accelerating your thinking. The other point I'd make is that you'd identify, I suppose, the common factors that create success in those roles, and then the likelihood of being able to find those talent profiles, because you can't find them, let's say, all at the same speed or all at the same pace and at the same time. So you have to understand, sometimes you go where the market capability is and you go where the market availability is for the talent. So if I share with you an example of building a data democratization model, if you're to do that at speed, and if you're to do that in a way which is generating value very quickly for an organization, that individual is likely to need to come with transformational expertise, because they're entering into a transformational environment. That person has to have deep subject matter expertise in what they're aiming to deliver. So we have to find an organization that's sufficiently deep and complex enough to bring that expertise with them. And they have to have this sort of consulting skill set or consulting mindset, which enables them to navigate quite an ambiguous environment quite quickly. And when we look at those three capabilities in a Venn diagram, some talent pools, you can find that rich mix quite quickly. Other
Mm.
talent pools, it's much, much harder. And you have to look in a much broader sense and more laterally, if you like. If you overlay on that a diversity and inclusion angle, then you really have quite a wicked problem to try and solve quickly. Where do I find the relevant leader with those right competencies and capabilities quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. Is it worth bringing up the visual to give
Yes,
people
yeah, please
a
do.
vision of
Yeah,
that?
yeah,
Should we add that?
please
So,
do.
so
Um,
this gives everyone a visual of what James was just referring to there. You can see the sort of the sweet spot of that Venn diagram. Um, so, I guess, given what you said, then, so these people weren't traditionally from competitors necessarily. And you'd have to, as we say, find synergistic. I don't know if that's a word. Is it synergistic organisations?
I,
It
I hope
sounds
so. I've been using it a lot. So
okay. Good. It sounds okay. Yeah, synergistic organisations. But throughout this process, were there any organisations that came up, or sectors that surprised you that had
yes.
these synergies?
So interestingly, when I first arrived in the business, I was told, emphatically by people, I needed to go, as you can see on this slide, to the FANGs, and I need to go to the big tech players, and that was the place I was going to find these skill sets. And of course, when you get to a particular scale at a Microsoft, or you get to a particular scale at an Amazon, you are going to find these blends, not just from a expertise perspective, but just from the sheer headcount and population that you're looking at. Where I was surprised was actually the bottom point, which I forgot to mention, which is looking at heritage or legacy organizations and businesses that had been through a digital transformation program, or been through a modernization program, or a data led transformation, where they've had to productize and digitize their offer from legacy. So if you look at, for instance, the gaming industry, what used to be gambling and betting and used to be very much a retail model is now very much an online play, an app-based play. That's one area. Another area might be looking at infrastructure, which historically was a blue-collar, resource-heavy, sync matrix type business, which has now had to digitize because a lot of the systems and hardware and infrastructure they work with are digitally based. Even things like the transport industry, where if you look at the hire car industry, if you look at the logistics industry, you find that large global organizations have gone through similar digital transformations at speed. And there are really valuable learnings from those organizations to bring into an organization like ours. So they're the ones that did surprise me along the journey, having been told we would only find these people in technology businesses.
Yeah, it's a great point, because I think those industries you mentioned, I don't think I'm being unkind in saying transport, gaming, infrastructure, maybe might seem quite unfashionable
Yeah,
industries. And actually, if you consistently only look at FANG, and you're missing out potentially on great talent and great opportunities, I think.
correct.
Um, okay. In terms of, I think one of the things you picked up on there as well was uh, sort of looking for the center of that Venn diagram. That's difficult. Did that come with any? Did you have to think about compensation, I guess, as part of this process? How important was that? And sort of where did you feel you had to pitch that in the market?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So, look, it's one thing to identify and source individuals and individual profiles to help you the transformation. You've gone straight to the the headhunter question of how do I then convert that to a successful hire that's then
Mm,
retained in role. It's not easy because, as I've mentioned, there's lots of organizations and lots of industries going through similar change. So we're all looking for these digitally savvy, data enabled, technology driven leadership profiles that also have to come with this kind of strategic mindset and have transformation DNA and have consulting expertise. So you're starting to create a lot of conditions for success there. I think for me, two things really add as the attraction. One is unprecedented, or the scale of unprecedented change that this individual would then bring. There aren't many organizations of a scale like ours going through an outside in transformation at speed. So it's a career defining opportunity if people get it right. Of course, they want to be recognized and rewarded for that. So your point on compensation is important. I think there's two factors. One is you're either value creation driven, in which case you want to see significant upside from your contribution, or you are organizationally and culturally driven in terms of wanting to engage and belong with a team, or belong to a successful team over a, say, 2 or 3 year transformation horizon. So what
mm,
we had to do was think in quite an agile way about what would encourage or what would incentivize people over that time horizon. We don't necessarily need leaders for a decade plus anymore. And that doesn't mean to say we don't want to keep leaders for a decade plus. Of course we do. And if they want to stay in our organization, we'll welcome them and keep them with open arms. It's more about recognizing a lot of leadership drivers now are about development and growth in role. And the speed of these transformation executions is such that that can happen in 2 to 3 years. So I suppose what I'm identifying is their drivers are perhaps around their growth and their contribution and their benchmark, as opposed to necessarily just the financial rewards. But you have to do them both, is the short answer. You have to create both the financial incentives, but also the development incentives for great people.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I
As we
take the point that's been made, by the way, on that in the risks there. in the comment from Jason. I take the point that yes, there is
Should we
an element
bring that up?
Yeah, there's an element of taking risk in the hiring. Absolutely.
Is this the comment that you?
Yeah, so I think there's 2
meant?
points there. One is, are we asking too much? Yes, often we are. And the second point is, can we take risk? And the answer to that is yes, we should.
In your view, if we are asking for too much, where are the parts that you can flex on that very well, it was more than three in the Venn diagram, really, wasn't it?
Sure,
Digital
sure.
transformation strategy. Where is where has been the flex in your experience?
So welcome to my world. This is probably what keeps me up at night and keeps me sort of most stressed in my role. There are trade-offs to be made with every single hire, and there are resolutions to be struck between different stakeholders' perspectives on what's going to bring value to your organization. Everything I said earlier about being able to demonstrate the commercial value that can be brought, once you've established that and you've got buy-in and the individuals then start talking about particular leadership profiles, you have to make sure that those leaders are consciously addressing any bias that they may have, and also accepting that it might not be in one individual, it might be a blended team. And this is where my role becomes really interesting, because I get to look at the balance of capability across a community of senior leadership roles, as opposed to looking for it in one individual. And that's where, when I'm sitting down in the executive search firm, or we're talking directly to a hiring manager at board level or board minus, we're encouraging them to think about their blended team. I'll use a very live example. If we are looking for someone who has consummate capability in the data space, and a critical part of it must be Google Cloud and must be managing Google Cloud with external partners, well, why not remove that default requirement from the role type, enable the person to be very, very good at strategic partner management and strategic data leadership in our business, and hire in someone who specializes in Google Cloud to work with them? That's an example of where, if you're over specifying on the criteria, you're likely to really limit your talent pool and probably actually not achieve the outcome you're looking for. So that blended team piece is super important to start early with your leadership and say, I'm not going to build you a 1 in a million candidate. I'm going to build you a 1 in 100 candidate, around which we're going to orientate some 1 in 1000s. That's where I want to get to.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point for anyone that's listening that might be about to go through this from a talent perspective, because I think the common way of doing that is insisting, no, they must be a Google Cloud expert first.
Exactly.
And thinking of it in that way, I think is a great thing. Just to follow up from, so Jason added after this as well, we hire for people that know how to get things done. The AI and tech skills can be learned, but in uncertain times, you have to take a few risks in hiring. Yeah, that's probably true. And as James says, there's trade-offs and everything. I think there's no solutions, only trade-offs. I think someone great man once said. I feel like we could probably talk about this topic forever, forever, Jay. We're going to have to move on just for time, unfortunately. Just quickly, any questions? We're going to be going into Q&A probably in about 10 minutes. So any questions, please get them in now as soon as you can. Let's move on then to the concept of talent density. Which well, I'll let you explain it, James. So explain this as a concept, because I think it's an important concept for anyone that might be going through a similar transformation or hiring uh, teams in this area.
So same principle as the Amazon flywheel. This is shamelessly borrowed from Netflix's now infamous talent density approach, and you can watch YouTube videos and interviews and again read business articles on its approach. It's the simple concept that as you approach increasing complexity and increasing scale in an organization, your likelihood of retaining high performance employees, and those high performing employees as a percentage of your organization, reduces. So you have to consciously address how you're able to attract and retain high value people who hit those value creation hypotheses we talked about earlier. Organizations that unconsciously grow in this way or don't consciously think in this way are less likely to be successful in the long term, because as your complexity increases, as your scale increases, your propensity to settle for median performance increases. It's a really difficult concept to land. I suppose, as you said, you can talk for hours about the concept, but in reality, it's really hard. You can start out with the best of intentions, but sustaining it and finishing that journey in a sort of future fit way is really, really tough for a couple of reasons. One is, you've mentioned already, pay. You've got to pay at the top of the market to get those top performers. So that can often be a bar to entry for some organizations, not just from a commercial lens, but also from an internal parity and equity lens with their existing teams.
Yeah.
Then there's the assessment piece, getting alignment on what people believe in as valuable and what people believe in as long-term investment requires quite stringent assessment criteria and common criteria across your whole organization. And of course, there's the horrible end of it and the nasty end of it, which is the firing and the exiting and the right sizing that you need to do in order to fund the other two. So if you can attract the right people and pay the right amount, if you can do the assessment and the retention and the keeper test, as Netflix refer to it, you also have to fund that through severance and exits, and landing that cycle, sustaining that cycle in a sustainable way that doesn't break your business or doesn't damage you culturally is pretty tough. And there's common themes that come up in it: transparency, autonomy, trust, professionalism, learning focused organizations. Everyone can buy into those positive aspects of the talent density program. But when the downside is perhaps cultural mismatch, perhaps exiting long tenured employees, perhaps having to change ways of working that have existed and supported the organization for decades, that's when talent density becomes really, really tough.
Yeah. Is it worth me adding this? I don't know if this
Yes, of course. Yeah. I mean,
this is a
this is the
slide that
reality of,
James
yeah,
sort of passed me. So some of this will sort of uh, back up what James has just been talking about. But I think so one of the major concepts is as you grow, the quality inevitably tends to start to dip, and it's guarding against that as you grow
correct.
is the idea.
Yeah. And also, as the program progresses, you'll see on the left hand side there's an assessment pentagram there which shows capability. Then there's the landing pad, which is the way in which the individual joins the organization, and then there's activating and retaining those people. So if you think about the model here, it's trying to assure you've got the right bench from the market, ensure the person lands and starts well, and ensures they're sustained in their role. Now, some of these things, even since we created this slide, some of the focus and the concentration has shifted. But it is about making sure that those individuals feel engaged, feel mobilized, and feel rewarded and recognized for their contribution. Otherwise, you just get the classic kind of organ rejection and, face doesn't fit type feedback for individuals, which is, going back to the point that Jason made in the comments, always a risk factor in hiring.
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple of things we've chatted about off air, and I know they're bullet points on this slide, are talent pooling and bench strength building. So those are sort of concepts maybe that might not be familiar to everyone in a talent or business leadership role listening to this. So can you expand on those a bit more?
Sure. I mean, it's the same principle we described earlier for value creation, but focused on role types. So if you map your executive roles and you map your leadership roles in an organization, typically in a PEVC environment, it's your top 100 roles, top sort of leadership roles. In large organizations, that population could be higher, up to sort of 300 to 500 people, but it's mapping out those roles and attributing a value to them across your enterprise. Once you've done that, your bench strength is all about, do you have an internal succession plan, or do you have an internal strength of talent that supports that continuing capability? In most cases, the answer is not quite as much as we'd like, so therefore we need to go to market. I mean, there's a correlation, right, between the value to you internally and the value of that individual in the market. So you'd be quite worried if it was the other way around. Something that was inherently valued to you wasn't valued by other people. So you have to bench strength in a digital way, which is mapping the market, knowing where people reside, knowing which organizations and teams they're from, knowing, to your point earlier, the push-pull factor in terms of why they might join your organization or why they wouldn't join your organization. So that's the bench strength building. In terms of the talent pooling, you can generally do that on a capability basis. So I mentioned earlier about product talent pool, data talent pool, sourcing talent pool. If you attribute your talent pools to those value creation cases, it becomes much easier to then create pools. If you start to do it by grade and job title and hierarchy, it becomes quite binary and difficult to maintain. So I would advocate always doing talent pooling and bench strength building from a capability lens. And then when the roles come up, you know that you've got a strong talent pool from which you can leverage the hiring that's needed.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think this concept is really important because no one, obviously, we want to keep attrition to a minimum, but when these important folks do leave your organisations, if you've built those talent pools and understand the market conditions, it's a lot less stressful than it otherwise might be. So, yeah, really important, I think. Okay, well, let's move on then, because we are running short on time. Again, it's a topic we could talk about forever, I think. But we're going to move on now to, let me just get rid of this slide. A really interesting, and by the way, on any of those sort of three stages that we've talked about, value creation verticals, flywheel effect, talent density, any questions, please get them in the comments. We'll do questions very shortly, but we're just going to quickly talk about a really interesting concept that James and I spoke about off air, which was how do you develop your workforce in the age of in the AI age, because that is changing and is going to change massively, which is going to be something I think of that every organization needs to think about. And as I said at the start, it's most of us would have started in our careers in organizations doing fairly admin heavy tasks to learn the business. In the age of AI, those tasks are going to be taken away. So how do you bring people into your business, train them up? What's the future, James?
So again, not just my work. This is the result of quite a deep and considered study by one of our shareholders, Telefonica, on what will AI do to their global workforce. And those of you that aren't aware, huge, telco history, over 100 years of history with Telefonica, so they really know what they're talking about from an industry perspective. I suppose our observation is that as you move AI and generative AI alongside the already adopted automation that you've gone on that journey, you disrupt the first 5-year cohort of most organizations. So the feeder cohort for future leadership is disrupted, hopefully in a positive way. But initially, this is where the sort of fear and inertia comes from about where do I start? If your graduate can't reconcile sales data on a spreadsheet for a sales career, if your programmer and coder is not getting the legwork that they used to get early in their career because it's automated and it's being done for them, these individuals then have to become experts on the products they're using and experts on the AI they're using, not on the detail or the content of what they're using. And I think a really a current example in my world is what used to be a 5 or a 6 week process to market map candidates from open source data can now be done in about 12 minutes using an AI scraping tool from the market. I think that's tremendously exciting, but for hundreds and hundreds of people whose job it is to research individual talent profiles in the market, it's probably quite terrifying. So I think if you're values led in terms of where you're using your AI and where you're enabling your AI, you'll get your workforce to buy in a lot quicker to its value. If you start from a reductive context or a reductive position of how much this could save us or how much faster we can go, it's no wonder people feel like they're left behind a little bit.
Yeah. So I guess the trick is to try and remove the fear, and it just means that, to boil it down, to some extent, people are going to have to be experts just in slightly different areas.
Yeah, I
Is
mean,
that fair?
to make it really specific, you've got transactional tasks which we know will become less and less common because the AI will pick that up for us. So if you have roles that are predominantly related to transactional tasks, you move those people to relational tasks. So if I go back to the sales example, don't run the data on the CRM, build relationships with your clients. Now that should be quite welcome to people who want to build a career in sales.
Yeah.
But you've got to get over the fear factor of, well, that means you need 90% less transactional task people and only 10% will be retained. So I think you
Yeah.
start that journey of transactional tasks to relational tasks, and you really over index on the expertise or the expertise tasks, which is knowledge of the systems, products, and platforms you're using.
Yeah. Yeah, I see. And I guess if you present that and communicate that in a way
Exactly. Yeah.
that's value led, hopefully that should um, remove the fear in many cases.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah. Okay, Jay. Well, I mean, this is just a concept which I think we could probably do an episode on in itself. But it's something that everyone I think should start thinking about because it's coming. Let's move on to some Q&A now, James, just to finish.
Sure.
What we and so if anyone's got any questions, please get them in very quickly now because we're going to be finishing in the next 5 to 10 minutes. Um, Matthew has asked, is there a ceiling to the level of seniority that talent density is applicable? Would you build talent pools for C-suite as an example?
Yeah, really, really great question, Matthew. Thank you. Yes, is the short answer. If you look at how investors look at their boards and look at their leadership teams, they do exactly what I describe. I think what was common for the last couple of decades with PE investment would have been looking critically at the board and critically at the key players at executive committee level and below. What I'm seeing now is a need to go deeper into some of those verticals I mentioned earlier. The world's more complex, transformation programs are more ambitious. It's harder perhaps to realize some of the gains than it used to be. So yes is the short answer, but it also goes a lot deeper now. It probably goes to N-3, which is 2 reporting layers away from the CEO. And before that would have been unthinkable that we'd think about talent density in that way. But we need to, I think.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of talent density, can you touch upon or just expand upon a bit more? What are the kind of ways that you can go about optimizing talent density? Is there a sort of 2 or 3 part, I don't know, strategy that people can take away in terms of how to optimize? Because I think it's understanding that concept of, with growth comes potentially sort of lower quality. But how do you? What are I don't know. Is there a 3 part framework or something that you've got that can help people put something in place?
I don't have a framework as such. I mean, I'll talk about how I reconcile it, and this is literally just my sort of coping mechanism for how to do
Mm,
something which is inherently really complex. I mean, whenever you get to senior people profiles or executive people profiles, there's always an interplay which is very, very difficult to map or very, very difficult to measure and define. But the way I've liked to think about it when looking for roles is um, talent density often has the strongest correlation back to your business transformation, your business question that you're trying to answer. So you find the role that has the strongest correlation or the easiest link between your business strategy and the thing that needs to change or the thing that needs to be done. And that's often manifest as something called like the imperative for the change or the catalyst for change. So every role that's linked to your imperative for change, whether that's disruption, whether that's new technology, whether that is M&A activity, whatever it might be, you've got an imperative for change for the organization. The roles that have the strongest correlation to the imperative for change are probably likely to be your talent density roles. Then you have your human element, which is your sponsorship. Those roles that have the strongest correlation to EC level sponsorship, board level sponsorship. If your CFO is worried about something, the likelihood is it's probably related to some of your talent density objectives, or at least you hope it is. So there's this proximity piece to who is the sponsor and why are they interested. And the third part is hopefully very relevant for this audience, which is the technology. If you can see a really strong dependency between your technology changes, whether that's in data, in product, in platform, in software, and you can see a strong correlation between the talent profile or the role and the technology change, that is a strong pointer. If you get 3 out of 3, I would probably then say you've got a very strong probability of that being a talent density role.
yeah, absolutely. I think thanks for that, by the way. I think one key point I'm drawing out of this is that if anyone's in a talent or search role, external or external, it's understanding the business imperatives,
Yeah.
because I think there's often a big disconnect there between leaders not conveying the business imperative to their talent partners, whoever they might be. But that's absolutely crucial, I think, in this. Um, Swanand asks, how can leadership candidates position themselves at the intersection of the three circles that you mentioned? How do we communicate our value proposition?
Great. Thank you for the question, Swan. And I think two things that I've seen interview work very, very well. One is tying your skills, your experience, your knowledge into the commercial value proposition of the role. And that can be measured in efficiency gain, FTE reduction, technology implementation, or out and out savings or commercial gain through increased sale, increased revenue, increased EBITDA. So tying your capability to a commercial metric or some upside in dollars, pounds, pence, however you want to describe it. The second part is, and it goes back to those parts of the Venn. Somebody said about transformation earlier in the comments being the critical factor. Being able to demonstrate a tenacity or a resilience to carry you through what's inevitably going to be a tough journey. One of the things that I see in candidates is the ability to navigate ambiguity really, really well and still achieve their objective in a sustainable way. Transformation is by its nature challenging. Otherwise, it wouldn't be transformational. If it doesn't hurt, it's not working. But your ability as an individual to carry that pain and that load and to navigate the ambiguity, that's a key differentiator when it comes to bringing people into these environments.
Quick question from me on that actually is, how do you, are there any ways, tips or tricks at interview that help you assess how people are going to react in that environment, how they can navigate that ambiguity? Because I guess it's a very easy thing to talk about potentially at an interview, but it's kind of how do you maybe assess that and get a real insight to how they're going to behave in those environments?
Yeah, so very, very briefly again, because you could probably spend another 10 minutes on this answer. Assessment's really critical, making sure you've understood your critical behavioral tendencies. It's not the total answer, it's another data point in the selection. Having the right assessment criteria is critical. So we have a disruptive leader profile, for instance, that we've devised as one of our assessment profiles we use. In the interview itself, taking people through a panel type discussion with a particular case study, whether that's your case study that they've been asked to work on or whether it's their case study that they brought with them. And in a panel discussion, it enables people to think and process. So it's more of a dialogue around a whiteboard than it is a one-to-one question set. The third one, interestingly, is quite personal and is quite individually driven, talking about a time that someone's been challenged in their life. And when you ask that question to people in the sort of discovery phase of the interview, you hear some amazing stories from individuals and how they've got to where they are. I think it's easy in the corporate world to assume that everyone's had a gilded path to where they've arrived. Actually, by asking some in a safe environment, asking some really open questions, you hear some terrific stories about what's developed that resilience and what's developed that mindset for the individual. So that's something we do major on is some sort of challenge in their life which has brought them to this point.
And presumably for that, you're looking for things sort of external to the corporate world.
They may be, Jeremy, but I mean, sometimes they talk about, a business that folded or a startup that failed or a business that went through distress, but you do more than often hear people's personal stories about their journey, either in their younger life or their current journey with their family, or it might be relocating to another country. It might be a career pivot or a change they've done. But I just encourage people to ask openly those questions or be prepared to answer those questions, because it really reveals a lot about a person's capability when they get into those type of stories.
Yeah, absolutely. One more question from me, James, just before we go, because we will run out of time. But it was to your in your view, have external. I mean, we've been through a lot in the world over the last maybe 3 or 4 years. Lots of change, COVID, geopolitical tensions, economic crisis. Has any of that changed or influenced the way you've hired or who you've hired?
It's a great question. I think we all have a responsibility now to be more sensitive to the impact of those macroeconomic events and geopolitical events on our teams. So I've definitely seen an increase in awareness and sensitivity of those individuals to those macroeconomic changes and geopolitical changes, especially the socio-political changes we're seeing in certain countries. there is a challenge in that you're then getting sort of quite personal to an individual about what perhaps their political beliefs are, what perhaps their religious beliefs are, what their values and systems are. That I think is somewhat overstepping the bounds sometimes. So I think there's a degree of sensitivity that someone has to display or address or show. I don't think that necessarily then extends to having a strong opinion on a subject. That would be my personal advice, and I'm not advocating that for any other organization or any other team, but that's personally how I would see it.
Yeah, great. Fantastic. James, thank you so much for logging on and being on Data and AI Live today. I think it's been a really insightful session. There's not many organizations who've gone through data and AI transformation at this scale, and I think a level of technology. So hopefully James's insights have been really helpful to some of our listeners in the business space, but also the talent space. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, James, what's the best way? Through LinkedIn or?
Yes, please. Yeah, always welcome to make connections via LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks again, James, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.